Hi everyone, this is Professor Antonelli and welcome to Psych 101 and our Chapter 5 lesson today on development. We did spend some time in class on this chapter, and we're going to do another class session actually on the second part of the chapter. We did spend a little time on the first part, but I'm going to put it all together as one PowerPoint for you so that you can listen to the recording of the entire chapter. Okay, so this chapter overall deals with both cognitive and social development over the range from infants all the way up through kind of adulthood, and we deal with a number of very important theorists in this chapter, including Piaget, Vygotsky, and Erickson. And I've broken up the chapter in when we did it in class by talking about prenatal and infant development in one lesson, and then talking about childhood, adolescence, and adulthood in a second lesson. So let's jump right in. There are a number of modules or sections of this chapter, but the beginning part really kind of talks about the kinds of studies that have been done to find out this information that we know about cognitive and social development across the age ranges. So, one of the two kinds of studies that we use are called cross sectional. The other kind is called longitudinal. Now, when we're a researcher, we kind of ask ourselves this one general question. Should a researcher study younger and older people at the same time? Or should we study one group of people as they advance from one age to another? Those are kind of the two questions to really help someone decide, do they want to do a cross-sectional study or a longitudinal study. So let's look at the difference. A cross-sectional study is basically taking several groups of people or subjects at different ages and studying them at the same time, at one particular time. So, for example, if we were going to compare the memory abilities of 3, 5, and 7-year-olds, there are the several groups because they're at different ages, 3-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 7-year-olds. But we're going to kind of look at their memory abilities at one time. So whether it's, during a certain week or a certain month, we just look at it. And in this example, it's using January 2012, where we look at the 3-year-olds, the 5-year-olds, and the 7-year-olds. So different groups, but at the same time. The advantage is that this can be done quite quickly. And we also don't run the risk of confusing kind of effects that we see of individuals when we study them based on their age as they age with the effects of society and changes that have happened in society that could be causing some of the differences. So because we're doing it at a snapshot at one period of time, like in January 2012, we can't say that, okay, over time in society, because we used more than 1 month, that something could have changed and affected the results of it. So that's what makes it an advantage. The disadvantage is that we kind of risk sampling error, it's called, by getting different kinds of people at different ages, that could not be a true representative sample then. So that's kind of one of the disadvantages. And we also, as a result of this, we risk what we call cohort effects. Cohort effects are, the effects that could happen as a cohort or a group of people that are born at a particular time experience different things from groups of people, let's say, born at other times. So, a cohort of individuals born in 1970 could be very different in the things they've experienced than a cohort of people who were born, let's say, in 1980, because there's a 10-year age difference there. Okay, so that's one of the disadvantages of this. And I'm going to just skip ahead 2 slides because this shows the example of what we mean by cohort effects. Is when people are born at different times, they often have these different experiences based on what's going on in society at the time. So this was the 2 pictures showing 2 women in bathing suits, one on the left, one on the right. The one on the left was born during an earlier time. That's obviously a very dated picture. And that particular person was being inspected by what we called bathing suit inspectors at the time to say that, her bathing suit was either okay or overly revealing. Whereas Today, looking at the girl on the right, that particular photo, contemporary, current, modern day, would not be considered overly revealing because, again, different time periods in society portray different kinds of things that are acceptable or unacceptable. Okay, so that's the idea of a cohort effect. Now I'm going to go back. That's the first study, cross sectional. The second study is called a longitudinal study. This is actually one of my favorites. And in a longitudinal study, we use one group of subjects and we study them at different times as they grow older. So, for example, we would take a group of 3-year-olds in January 2012 and we would study their memory abilities. Then, 2 years later, we would take that same group of 3-year-olds and look at their memory abilities again. And then 2 years later, in January 2016, we would use those same 3-year-olds we started with, and they're now 4 years older, and we would study their memory abilities at that time, when they're 7 years old. No, I'm sorry, 6 years old. So it's really kind of no, 7 years old, right? January 2012 they were 3, in 2014 they were 5, and in 2016 they were 7. So again, same group, but just studying them over time, longitudinally is how we refer to it as. And it gives us some good information. Advantages: we don't have to worry about differences in the sample that we have and that we're using because it's the same individuals. In addition, another advantage is that we can look at the effects of one particular experience, because they all, let's say, are going to be given that experience because they're all born and have the same age and birthday. And we could look at that experience on how it helps them develop later. And then we can also study this consistency within the individuals because we're using the same ones over time. The disadvantages, of course, is that when you do something long or longitudinal, it takes a long time. And as a result, some participants might actually quit or drop out of the study. The other thing is that it's difficult then to separate what effects these individuals could be experiencing just from societal changes instead of their developmental changes. So that's kind of a disadvantage as well. All right. So again, when someone's trying to decide on what sort of study to use, they really have to look at a number of different things. Okay. Starting with prenatal, we kind of have to go back to some terminology like zygote, which is the fertilized egg after conception. And then at 6 weeks, we see some spontaneous movements of the fertilized egg. And then at 8 weeks, we call the zygote a fetus instead. And then after that 8-week period, there's some development of the sense organs, and the fetus can even yawn and hiccup in utero. We can actually see that. So these are just some of the terms without getting into too much of the beginning of life. That's what is kind of important to know, some of the big ideas behind it. Okay. The brain is a huge piece we've talked about in other chapters. It begins to mature way before actual day of birth. And prenatally, any exposure that the mother has to drugs, such as alcohol, can decrease the brain activity of the fetus, and it releases, the self-destruct programs within the neurons. And as we know, neurons are very important for developing connections within the brain to send messages to all parts of the body and receive messages. So one of the biggest issues with alcohol abuse during or use during pregnancy is something called fetal alcohol syndrome, also known as FAS. And the effects of fetal alcohol syndrome really do depend on timing and the amounts of alcohol that are consumed by the woman. Some of the effects we see are malformation of the face, where usually the eyes are spaced further apart after birth. There's malformations of the heart and the ears. There's nervous system damage, such as seizures. There's hyperactivity. There could be impairments of learning, memory, problem solving, attention, and motor coordination. So FAS is a very serious condition as a result of alcohol exposure. In addition, despite some circumstances that individuals may have prior to birth or during their early years, such as alcohol drugs, being in a disadvantaged home environment, or a victim of prejudice, people sometimes manage to do well despite these kinds of conditions that they've experienced early on in their life. Okay. One of the issues we're going to talk about is the vision of an infant. We can monitor the few actions that infants actually do to infer what they might be understanding. So, much visual experience infants have is could be by 5 months they do have a great deal of visual experience. So, but there's little crawling or movement. But as with everything, they learn gradually. Okay, there's something called a visual cliff experiment in the text, which talks about as infants are learning, they crawl and they're learning kind of depth and perception, and how they won't, crawl off something where they could fall like a step, because they develop that over time. It's an interesting experiment in the text that they talk about. So, this general slide about vision talks about how human faces is kind of what infants view and spend more time looking at than anything else. Even a 2-day old infant looks at human faces more than any other patterns, with similar areas of kind of this light and dark shadowing thing. Um, they look at faces really more as just an oval, with more of what they see toward the top of that oval. And in the text itself, there's also a number of different pictures of faces, some that are normal faces where the eyes and nose and mouth would be in a normal location, and others are kind of distorted where maybe the nose is turned sideways, or the eyes are where the mouth is and the mouth is reversed up where the eyes are. And they found that infants seem to gaze equally at normal and distorted faces. Okay, so over time and developing over years is the recognition of faces, the ability to recognize distinctions between faces. And there's differences between, let's say, 4-year-olds and 6-year-olds, where 4-year-olds have trouble with picking a normal picture of a child versus, let's say, an altered one, if there's some facial features that have been altered. But a 6-year-old could easily see a difference between one photo of a face and another. Okay, even if there's a slightest, the eyes are moved down, or the nose is a different shape. It's more towards 6 years old that they could see that actual differences. All right, and again, infants basically become best at recognizing the kinds of faces if they see them more and more. So the more they see them, the more they recognize them. Okay, so they often recognize their mother obviously before anyone else. In addition to hearing, in addition to vision, infants also have some things related to hearing that we need to know about. Okay, so how do we measure hearing in infants? Since we can't have them, we can't play a sound for them and have them raise their right hand or left hand. They're infants. So the way we measure hearing in infants is through sucking of a bottle or pacifier. When they hear certain kinds of sounds, they tend to do more vigorous sucking. That's kind of how we can measure this. All right. Habituation is when an infant hears a certain sound, increases their sucking rate, and then we repeat that sound or stimulus, and they become accustomed to it, or it becomes a habit for them to hear that, and their sucking rate decreases. That's called habituation. All right. And then dishabituation is when a new sound is introduced, and then the sucking rate increases again. Okay, so that there's a bit of a change there. All right, this helps to really tell us that infants can detect the difference between two sounds, which is important, of course, for their later language comprehension when they're trying to learn the different sounds of letters and then short and long vowels. Though we see that they can actually start doing this very early on. Okay, within a few months, an infant can distinguish among all the sounds that actually occur in any language, and more importantly, they can distinguish among all the sounds in the language that they are about to learn. Okay, so again, infants' vision, infants' hearing, all interesting ways that we've studied and learned about them. Another area we need to look at is infants' learning and memory. Now, how can we measure learning and memory in infants who cannot speak? Well, they did an experiment with pregnant women, and they had them read a nursery rhyme, and they monitored the heart rate of the fetus and found it to increase to the familiar nursery rhyme. But then when we had the pregnant woman read an unfamiliar one, the heart rate did not increase. So we can kind of infer a few things from that, that they have learned the sound of the mother's voice before birth, but more importantly in that case is that they kind of recognize the familiar rhyme, okay, which really ties in better with, you know, are they experiencing some learning and memory even before birth? Okay. Within the first 3 days of life, newborns suck more vigorously to turn on a recording of their own mother's voice than some other woman's voice. This, of course, is an indication that they can recognize the sound of their mother's voice. And then infants that are just 2 months old learn to kick and move a mobile. And they did an experiment by tying a ribbon onto the ankle of the infant and to the mobile. And the infant was able to kind of make that connection of, oh, if I move my leg, the mobile will move as well. And they actually remembered 2 days later when they tried the experiment again, they remembered to pull their leg and do their, move the mobile as well. So even though they had little control over their leg muscles, they did remember and didn't, need that actual control to keep the mobile going. They just learned that, okay, if I just kind of, move it, then the mobile will move as well. Okay. Now we get into some of the theorists, especially Piaget is who we start with. Piaget kind of talks about cognitive development and how children construct meaning of what they're learning. They don't just accumulate facts that someone tells them. They actually have to kind of work through something and be very active in how they go about doing it. Okay, so it's important to know a couple of things about Piaget, a couple of important terms called assimilation and accommodation. What that means is as children are learning, young children are learning things, they kind of try to compare it to things they already know and try to fit it into their way of organization of objects. So if they're trying to learn about a new object and they see it as similar to something else, then they assimilate it into the structure in their brain that says, hey, that's like something else. If they learn about something and they don't see it as similar to something else, or they can't fit it into something that they already know, then they kind of get thrown off balance a bit. It's called disequilibrium. And they have to kind of say to themselves, hey, I need to create a whole new section in my brain to fit this new concept or topic or object or whatever I just learned about into, because I don't see anything else like it that I already know. So while they're kind of figuring that all out and in disequilibrium, they have to make an accommodation for the new information or the new object they're learning about, and they have to put it in a new section, okay, of their brain. Then once they do that and everything seems good again, that's called equilibration, meaning we're back to kind of this equilibrium of feeling like, okay, I found a new spot for this information. Okay, those are two very, very important terms in Piaget's theory that we do need to keep in mind when we're studying Piaget. Okay, Piaget has four major stages of what we call intellectual development or cognitive development. And each of the stages has a general time frame, but again, the ages should be thought of in a way of they're variable. They're not set in stone and absolute, but everyone does progress through them in the same order. So the sensory motor stage goes from birth to 2 years old, and then pre-operational from just before 2 to 7, and the concrete operations from 7 to about 11, and formal operations from about 11 years onward. But a couple things, remember, those ranges are not absolute, but someone can't go start any concrete operations and then go back to sensory motor. It doesn't work that way. They have to go in the same order. Another informational piece about the formal operation stage is that not actually everyone reached that. Even though it's from about 11 years onward, not everybody reaches that stage, okay? The next few slides give some great information on each of these stages, so let's take a look at each of them. Let's start with sensory motor. Birth to about a year or a year and a half, and during this stage, the infant reacts to sensory stimuli through either their reflexes, their involuntary reflexes, or other responses. Now, sensory stimuli, remember the word sense or senses, having to do with sensory motor, and that is they experience things and learn about things through their vision, what they see, what they hear. That's why we just talked about vision and hearing. What they taste, what they smell, what they touch, tactile. All of these things are their senses, what they, that they react to by doing. Okay. The limitations of this stage is that they have very little use of language during the birth to year and a half. Um, they seem not to understand this concept over here that we call object permanence. Object permanence, think of it as that peekaboo game, out of sight to an infant when an object is covered by, let's say, a blanket, means out of existence. So in the early part of this sensory motor stage, think of a child who is playing with a toy, and we as the adult kind of cover that toy with a blanket. The infant will not look for it underneath that blanket, okay, because they have not reached the object permanence. They can't understand that an object's still there, even if we've covered it, let's just say, or it's out of sight. That's the concept of object permanence, okay? The second stage is called pre-operational. It's 1.5 to 7 years old. Here is where the child develops language. They can use that language to kind of represent objects, what they are. They'll put simple words to it. They can respond to objects that are remembered but not present. So that means they've developed object permanence sometime within this time period, usually closer to that 1.5. They'll develop that. But they don't have what we call a theory of mind, which means that other people have a mind too and know some things that I may not know. They can't. They don't have this. They just think that, okay, I'm the only one who kind of knows these things. They're not able to see that other people have know things as well. Okay, limitations. They cannot do what we call reversible mental processes. That means I have a brother, but my brother doesn't. Okay, so you got to think about this, and that if a child has a sibling, they can recognize that they have a brother, but they don't recognize that that brother has a brother, which is the child themselves who's thinking this. Okay, they can't reverse that kind of process in their head. They also cannot deal with this concept of conservation. Conservation is when, let's say, we have two cups. One is kind of short and fat, and the other cup is tall and skinny, yet we have a liquid in each cup. If we pour the liquid from the tall, skinny cup into the fat, short cup, is it the same amount if we have the liquid in both cups? Well, they can't see this conservation. They just see there's more liquid in the tall, skinny cup, even if the liquid is the same amount in both cups, because it's going to look different. It's going to look like there's more in the tall, skinny cup. That's what we mean by the concept of conservation, okay? They also have trouble focusing on more than one property at a time. The length and width of something, they could see length, and when they're not thinking about length, then they can see width, but they can't see them both at once. They also cannot distinguish appearance from reality a lot of the time. For example, if we have a white ball and we put it behind a blue filter, they will say, oh, the ball is blue. They won't be able to distinguish that. It's not the ball that's blue, it's the filter in front of it that's blue, okay? Also big in pre-operational stage is that children are egocentric. Egocentric does not mean that they're selfish. What it means is that they kind of see, they only see what's around them, and they can't take another's perspective. That is not being selfish. That's a different kind of viewpoint, okay? The third stage of Piaget is called concrete operations, ages 7 to 11. This is where they can start understanding that the two cups have the same amount of liquid in them. That's conservation of volume. They can tell differences between things. They can sort of start logically reasoning when it comes to a concrete object that they can actually see or touch. Okay, so they have to be able to see and touch something to be able to say, okay, this is this and this is this, and it feels like, this, and this rock weighs the same as this rock. They can do that in concrete operations, but they cannot reason about abstract concepts and hypotheticals, like what would you do if. Very difficult for 7 to 11-year-olds in concrete operations. And then formal operations is where 11 years onward, if individuals get to that, and remember, as we said, some do not, they can reason more logically about these abstract hypothetical things. They can develop a plan, to kind of put something into action, and they must, in the formal operation stage, most individuals must put in some sort of some sort of plan in order to problem solve. Let's just say they'll be more regimented and more kind of set in how they go about solving a problem. Okay, they have a lot more of the step-by-step thing when they're working in formal operation stage. Okay, our Piaget stage is distinct. Well, Piaget believed children can go from one stage to another, but it's not like, okay, they finished in stage one, so they're just going on to stage two, and there's nothing that they'll go back to in stage one. That's not what it means. It's more of a gradual and continuous thing. We haven't mastered. They may not have mastered all of one stage before being able to do some things in the next, because it fluctuates. Their performance at doing certain tasks will fluctuate back and forth between doing some things, building on what was learned in the prior stage and then moving forward. Okay, couple of differing views between Piaget and another theorist who's very big in child development, Vygotsky. Piaget kind of views that children must discover certain concepts on their own, also known as active constructivism. They often work through something. They'll discover something if we give them a chance to figure it out on their own. And that's the main view of Piaget. However, Russian psychologist Vygotsky kind of argued that, if we're an educator trying to teach children things, we shouldn't just let them kind of figure it all out on their own. We should help in a way by kind of setting the stage, helping them, asking questions, giving them, some information and working through things with them. And this should all take place within what we call the ZPD, or zone of proximal development. This is kind of like an area where children can do certain things alone, and or they can do things only with help from the adult or a more experienced person. So a child is in the zone when they can't actually do a task on their own, but they can do it with help. Okay, if they can't do a task at all, even with help, they're not in the zone. And if they can do a task all by themselves without help, then they're also not in the zone. Okay, it has to be they can do a task, but they need help to be in the zone. Okay, the last piece of this module kind of talks about how grown up are we, where as we look at developmental changes in growth, from all these stages of childhood going up through, they kind of talk about, at times we go back to this egocentric thinking, where as an adult we even think, okay, I'm the only one that really knows this, others don't really know it. And that's kind of reverting a little bit back to our childlike reasoning. And a great example of this is, if I said to you, the daughter of the man and the woman arrived, how would you interpret that? How would you reason through that? Are we talking about one person, meaning the daughter of the man and the woman? Or are we talking about two people, the daughter of the man and then a separate woman who has arrived, if you think about the way that sentence is worded? So they give that example in the book, which is really interesting. Okay, moving on to the second section, which captures a lot with social emotional development, and the focus is on Erikson and his stages. Erikson does have a number of stages where each age in each of those stages has its own concerns, opportunities, and pleasures. There's a conflict that happens at each of these stages. And then basically the conflict gets resolved at some point, and they're able to move on to the next stage. So the infant the infant has a conflict of basic trust versus mistrust, where the question is my social world predictable and supportive? If it is, if that infant is taken care of, um, you know then they form a strong attachment and positive relationships with people later. However, if they don't, they have some issues with attachment. So I want to talk about attachment a little more. I'm going to come back to this slide, but I need to go ahead to this slide. Attachment is where we have a feeling of closeness toward another person. It begins in infancy, and that all comes from that first stage of Erickson's theory. Okay, there are certain categories of attachment that we need to be aware of. They are what's called securely attached, where an infant has a positive attachment to the adults in their life. So even if the adult were to leave and come back, they're securely attached. There's an anxious or resistant attachment, where sometimes the mother's able to calm a child if she has to leave and then come back. Other times she's not able to do that. The child's a little bit anxious. Then there's avoidant as a category, where if a mother goes away and comes back, the infant doesn't necessarily kind of interact or stay close to her. They kind of avoid her. And then there's this disorganized attachment to a caregiver, where sometimes the infant doesn't even notice if the parent or caregiver or mother leaves, or looks away. They kind of, sometimes it's very disorganized. They alternate between approaching the caregiver or avoiding them, and then showing more fear. It's this kind of very disorganized reactions. Okay, and there was something called the strange situation, which was a video clip that I put in my announcement, so that you could get an idea of what goes on in that experiment, where the mother is in a room with a child and playing, and then the parent leaves and the baby starts crying, and then the mother comes back and soothes them, and then the baby's fine. But then the mother leaves again, and a stranger appears, and we monitor the child's behavior. The stranger cannot usually comfort the child, and the mother comes back and is able to comfort the child. It's a very interesting situation. I kind of hope that you actually watch that video. All right. And then the idea of temperament is a great definition, because it's a tendency to be active or inactive, and to respond vigorously or quietly to a new stimuli. It's a genetic trait, a genetic characteristic that's fairly consistent throughout our life. Individuals are known to have a difficult temperament if they're frightened more easily than others. And this continues on from infancy through adulthood. So it's really, really important to kind of, work within infants for basic trust and mistrust, going back to Erickson's stages, to form a trusting relationship, so that relationships later on can be positive and strong. All right. Erickson's second stage, the toddler stage, is ages 1 to 3. This is where they either get a sense of autonomy or independence versus shame and doubt. And the question that comes up here always is, can I do things by myself, or must I always rely on others? These are the toddlers who want to, put their own shoes on, even if they put them on the wrong feet. Do we correct them? Do we not? Because if we correct them, they may experience shame and doubt. Whereas, otherwise they're experiencing independence and autonomy, which is the positive piece of the conflict. And when they feel they can do things by themselves, we have more positive outcomes. The preschool child, ages 3 to 6, have this conflict of initiative versus guilt, where they, answer the question typically, am I good or bad? When they try to do something, do they get in trouble? Are they yelled at? Or did they do something that they're, experiencing guilt about, because it was, in their words, quote unquote, a bad thing. I did a bad thing. Okay, so this is the conflict that often goes on between this ages 3 to 6. Pre-adolescent is ages 6 to 12, and the conflict here is, where are they industrious or productive, or do they feel inferior? So the question is, am I successful? Meaning, building up my self-esteem. Am I feeling success, or am I feeling this sense of being worthless because I can't do anything right? Okay, so this is a conflict that's experienced between ages 6 to 12. Adolescent is in early teens. So again, 13, 14, 15, 16, maybe 17. They have this identity versus role confusion. It's where they're trying to figure out, who am I? There is a whole slide that talks about the identity development piece, which we'll get to in a few minutes, so keep that one on your radar. And then we have young adults, which late teens, 18, 19, into the early 20s, where the conflict is intimacy versus isolation, meaning should I share my life with another person or live alone? This is the biggest time for that. And then middle adult is late 20s to retirement age, which is usually in the 60s, 65 or so. And this is the generativity versus stagnation. Generativity meaning, am I, do I have a job? Am I working? Am I generating and being productive? Will I succeed in my life, both as a parent and as a worker during this very long time frame of middle adulthood? Or have I become stagnant? I haven't gotten very far. I'm not doing very much. That's kind of the conflict that's experienced. And then the last stage is older adult, happening after retirement, usually 65. Ego integrity versus despair, meaning the ego integrity being the positive piece. Have I lived a full life? Or falling into despair if you answer, have I failed? And you answer yes, we have individuals falling into despair at that point. Okay, so there's a little bit more on each of these as the presentation goes on. We covered this slide on attachment, and we're moving into now social development. Social development in childhood and adolescence has to do with technically relationships with age mates, which become increasingly important in the childhood years and then into the adolescent years. In Western societies currently, we've had such an improvement in health and nutrition that the average age of puberty has been lowered. Okay. To the point of where, the onset of sexual maturity, which happens at puberty, kind of leads to sexual interest in peer relationships. That's why peer relationships become extremely important during the time period of childhood, late childhood into adolescence. Okay. But in today's society, economically, often young people, are encouraged to stay in school and postpone things like marriage and a family and a career, because they have to continue on this path of getting an education first. So it's during this period of time where there's a lot of physical maturity with puberty starting earlier, but then they don't often have that kind of adult status of marriage, family, and career. And so as a result, this peer relationships and this time of adolescence is often described as, this storm and stress, kind of time. It's very fluctuates a lot. It's characterized by a lot of moodiness. It's also in adolescence a time of risk-taking behaviors, where adolescent individuals, they know what danger is, they can describe dangers, but then they're quite impulsive, and they make decisions very quickly, and very rashly under peer pressure as a result. So there's always this high time of risk taking. We've also found, from a biological standpoint, going back to brain development that we've talked about in earlier chapters, that the prefrontal cortex part of the brain doesn't actually fully mature until the late teens. And we know that the prefrontal cortex is a structure in the brain that actually functions to inhibit inappropriate behaviors. So if that's not fully developing until the late teens, that gives us another explanation, from a biological brain standpoint, of why adolescent individuals tend to have higher risk-taking behaviors, because that prefrontal cortex is not developed. Okay, so continuing on, this goes back to Piaget's stage of identity development, where usually teenagers are asking themselves, who am I? I need to find myself. It's the early teen stage of identity versus role confusion. Okay, who am I? So individuals who are in this stage in their early teens, they tend to kind of try to figure out, what am I here for? What am I doing? Where am I going? All those kinds of questions. And there's kind of two things that we need to look at when, these early teens are exploring their identity development. And that is, are they actually questioning it? Are they thinking through things? Are they exploring things as part one? And then once they've done that exploring and kind of figuring out who they are, what they like, what their characteristics are, what they're interested in, then have they made any decisions? And there's this great kind of chart below that really combines these two questions into four areas. So let's take each one. So if the individual has explored or is exploring the issues and they've already made decisions about those things they've learned that they've explored, then they've actually achieved identity, meaning they know who they are, they know what they want, they know where they're going. Okay. um, However, if they've explored the or are exploring the issues but they haven't made any decisions, they're kind of like at a standstill, what we call identity moratorium. This is where they experiment and they imagine, their life in different ways, but they haven't made a firm decision yet on who they are and where they're going. When we go over to the blue box, where the individual has not explored any kinds of issues of what they want to be and where they want to go and what their plan is, but decisions have already been made for them for their future. And that often happens when a parent or family decides, for example, that that individual is going to go into the family business, or parents say, no, you're going to be a doctor, or you're going to do this. Then the decision's made for them, and they haven't explored any issues about themselves because the decision's already been made. And this is known as identity foreclosure. And then the last one is they haven't explored any issues. They're not trying to find out about themselves. They're not figuring out their interests or what they want to do or making plans, and they have not made any decisions. This is known as identity diffusion. They have really no path. They have no focus. They often tend to have low self esteem when they're in this identity diffusion area or section. They often have a hopeless attitude as to, like, well, where am I going to go? What am I going to do? They don't know. They're kind of stuck. They're sort of in limbo. Okay, so it's an interesting kind of thing. All right. As for teenagers, they often have this very interesting term called a personal fable. And David Elkind is the individual that came up with this idea of personal fable, and he kind of uses this concept to describe and support the idea of why individuals in the teen years participate in risky behaviors, because they have this belief that nothing bad can happen to me. And there's a number of statements that teenagers think about, and I'll read a couple of them to you. Other people may fail to realize their life ambitions, but I will realize mine. True or false? Think about that. I understand love and sex in a way that my parents never did. True or false? Tragedy may strike other people, but probably not me. That's the nothing bad can happen to me idea. True or false? And almost everyone notices how I look and how I dress. True or false? This is kind of this idea that teenagers have, that nothing can happen to them. No one knows how they're feeling. No one can compare to them. They know more than their parents. And again, what's interesting is that even though this focuses on teenagers, there are often middle-aged adults that experience this personal fable idea as well. So it's kind of interesting to think about. All right, moving into adulthood. Adulthood, the stage of adulthood is often starts at when individuals get their first job, and they're on their own. Until retirement years, okay? And even though there are stages within the adulthood section of time, they're not exactly named. We call them more like overlapping eras during adulthood, okay? And an individual named Daniel Levinson has come up with these, idea that there's a lot of overlapping kinds of time periods under the bigger umbrella of adulthood. Okay, so a major concern of adults is productivity, in reference to how good they're doing for their family, and productivity in their career. Are they moving forward? That kind of thing. And this idea of a midlife transition that adults often go through at some point in their adulthood life. It's a period of time during this stage where they reassess their goals. They may set new ones. They may start preparing for the rest of their life. Okay. This midlife transition often, or sometimes happens as a response to an event like a divorce or an illness or a career change, or it's based on kind of living in a society like ours where there are many choices. Okay, so individuals, depending on what society they live in, do they have choices? When they're in the middle stages of adulthood, to make a change or to do something different, or are they kind of set in one path and there's no chance to make any changes based on the society they're living in? That's a societal issue that will make a difference here in the midlife transition piece. Okay, then we get to the final stage of old age, where again, how you feel in old age really depends on what happened long before that. So what happened in all of the stages in Erickson's theory, prior to the old age stage, that is going to really have an impact on how individuals feel in this stage. Okay, do they feel ego integrity, where they say, I'm satisfied with my life experience that I've had? Or are they going to be filled with despair, where they have this feeling that they're not satisfied, they didn't reach the goals of their entire life, it's too late now, I can't do anything? Are they going to start feeling despair? Okay. Other issues under the old age category or stage is this idea of dignity and independence, meaning being able to do things on my own and do them well. The idea of dignity really does depend on families and communities. Specific communities and backgrounds and individuals in, let's say, Native American and African American cultures, they honor the elders. They say that, they really do experience dignity in those particular cultures, because all of those that are younger honor elders and respect them in various ways. Okay. The idea of loss of control, that's this piece here. This is kind of a serious issue in the old age category, when the health of an individual begins to fail. For example, if you're someone who's spent the last 50 years of your life running a business and making decisions, and now you can no longer make those decisions for whatever health reason, whether it's a dementia issue, or it's some other health reason that you can no longer make decisions for yourself and someone else has to make them, or you need to be in a nursing home for care and others need to make decisions. That's a serious issue when someone feels that they've lost control of their life in the age of when they're old, as an old age issue. Okay, so just something to think about. Then there's a whole section on, basically, well, people at all ages kind of face anxiety when they think about, that death is inevitable. This does not just have to happen at an older age. We often all face anxieties, and to combat these anxieties, we use what we call the terror management theory, where we cope with our fear of death by kind of either avoiding thoughts about it, so not thinking about it, and we also kind of affirm positive things. So we reassure ourselves by thinking about good things that we have, exciting things we have to look forward to, anything positive to provide us with a better self-esteem, hope in every day, and valuing life, is kind of the way that we face these anxieties of this inevitability of death kind of idea. Okay, the last section in this chapter has to really talks about this diversity issue of, are there differences between genders, are there cultural differences among individuals, and how they go through stages and their roles in life, and then family issues of how children are raised and what effects those have on their behaviors and how they're developing throughout life. Okay, there's an interesting piece on gender influences, where they found a lot of how men and women differ in various aspects of behavior, including interests. So there's an interesting section in the book that talks about males and females and behavioral differences. And it gives you a whole bunch of information that females are often, on average, better than males at recognizing faces and detecting emotional signals. Um, when giving directions, men are likely to use directions and distances, such as go 4 blocks east, whereas women are more likely to use landmarks, such as go until you see the library. Okay, um, it's interesting. Men and women differ in kind of behavioral ways. Some people believe men are better in math, and sometimes males outperform females in math. However, we have found that females often do as well or better than males on standardized tests in math and in their grades in nearly all the math courses. The one exception is that males tend to do better on geometrical tasks. Okay, so that's an interesting piece there. And then they also show differences in uh, certain things from childhood through adulthood. Males are more likely than females to devote almost all their energy to something singular, like a singular interest, one particular thing that they're interested in, whereas females are more likely to develop a variety of interests. Okay, there's differences in the way people rear their children as well, males to females, and a couple of other little tidbits. Research has found that girls who were exposed to a higher than average levels of the male hormone testosterone during prenatal development, which we've talked about, they tend to play with boys' toys more than average for other girls. So that's kind of an interesting thing when it comes to the testosterone levels prior to birth in the prenatal role. Okay, so lots of different gender influences. That's in the section on gender influences at the start of section 5.3, module 5.3. Then we have this idea of gender roles. They're also known as sex roles. And these are the different activities that society expects of males and females. So there's a couple of ways of looking at these. Sometimes these differences have to do with biology. An example is that women can actually nurse babies, whereas men cannot. That's a biological aspect. And generally, men have more physical strength than women. Both of those are biological aspects. However, some gender roles are things that society has set forth as a gender role. So think about a couple of things from long ago historically. The time of the cavemen, building a fire is the job of a man. As a role that they should play. Who should plant the crops, males or females? Who should milk the cows? Who should do the basket weaving? Like those kinds of activities, society has kind of set who should do those. There's not a biological aspect that's guiding those roles. Okay. And then over the last few decades, of course, gender roles have been changing in many ways, of course, in many countries. So it's important to keep in mind that this is something that will continue to change over time. Okay. Reasons behind these gender differences, both biological and social influences. We just talked about the greater size of males, and sometimes this influence of a prenatal hormone such as testosterone can influence a child's later interests, and these are biological influences. And then there's these social influences that actually a parent will convey to their children. They did an experiment, very interesting, that they described in the text, where they set up microphones and cameras in a science museum to eavesdrop on families as they were going through the museum. And it seemed like they found that boys and girls tend to look at all the exhibits in the museum kind of the same amounts of time, but they found that the parents were actually spending more time explaining to the boys kind of the scientific backgrounds of some of the things, the exhibits that they were looking on, more so than the girls, even if the boys and the girls were both asking similar questions or the same amounts of questions. The parents tended to give more scientific explanations to the boys than to the girls. So it's a really interesting study. You might want to check that out in the textbook as well. Okay. And then, as we said, across cultures, gender roles kind of vary significantly. Okay. We have also some cultural and ethnic influences on these things and behaviors. Some behaviors are remarkably similar, and they give a great example in the text that a non romantic hug lasts about 3 seconds, and they found this to be true across all cultures across the world. Okay, which is interesting. Um, However, in contrast, there are some other customs that vary tremendously, such as in Europe and North America, having a baby sleep in a crib is more acceptable than in Asia, where the baby sleeps in a parent's bed with them for a period of time. Okay, or another example is that peers in you know U.S. kids play with similar age peers, and in Africa and South America there are various ages that play together in groups that are not the same ages. So that's interesting. And then describing the effects of culture is difficult because we tend to overgeneralize. So, for example, when we say China is a collectivist culture where, they do lots of things in groups as a people, very not individualized. This is not true. We can't overgeneralize this because there are parts of China where there's rice farming that needs to have a group effort to do that farming, but in other areas of China where they do wheat farming, that kind of farming requires little or no cooperation, so they don't necessarily work in groups. So you kind of have to think about those things, all right? Um, and then we talk about ethnic minorities, where being a member of an ethnic minority raises special issues for identity development. Um, and this is a really something that we need to be working on. Achieving an ethnic identity is really something that is comparable to Erickson's theory of the adolescent time of identity, trying to figure out who am I, and it's often where, in most cases, minority group members um, who can achieve a strong ethnic identity often have a high self esteem. So the outcome really depends on the status of one's group. And I'll give you an example in Miami, Florida. Cuban Americans tend to have a very strong identity and a high self esteem, and that's because that group is dominant in the culture and politics of that region. Whereas Nicaraguan Americans in Miami, not so much do they have a strong identity because they're not a dominant culture there. Okay, and a couple of terms to round out the chapter had to do with biculturalism and biracialism, and the word bi has to do with two, so you might want to circle bi and then circle two. And this is a partial identification with two cultures. So for example, you might want to write here Mexican immigrants, they tend to speak Spanish and follow Mexican customs at home, but they tend to speak the English language and follow English customs of America, let's say, in other places outside the home. Okay, and then biracialism is this, by strict definition, means having parents from different origins. So we have individuals who have parents from African and European descent, or European and Hispanic descent, or Asian and Native American descent. Good example is our former president, Barack Obama. Okay. Um, and then the last couple of slides really talk about families and parenting styles. And in the birth order, we talk about there's lots of studies that compare, firstborn children versus later born children. And the problem with some of these studies is they're really flawed in that they're not really doing the comparisons properly. They're trying to compare, let's say, a firstborn child to a secondborn child in, let's say, 2 children families, and then comparing them to 5 children families, and you have to look at family size when doing these comparisons. So it's almost better to compare first and second born children in families of 2 children, but then you should compare first and third born children in families of 3 or more. You almost have to really compare the differences between children, looking at the size of the family. instead. That's some of the research is a little bit flawed in that area, so it's important to remember that. And as a result, because of the different sizes of families, there are different parenting styles that go along with those sizes of families. Okay, these effects often affect children's behavior and personality. So authoritative parents kind of set high standards. They have some control and rules, but they're also warm and responsive, and they're open to talking to children. Okay, this is kind of a give and take relationship. Authoritarian children, I always tell people, circle the TAR. Tar is this thick, black substance, that they put on driveways, makes it very rigid and non-movable. And these are parents who are very strict with their rules. They don't explain the reasons. It's my way or the highway kind of thing. Okay. And then permissive parents are those, that are, warm and loving, but they also don't have any kind of goals or demands or, requirements for the children, very permissive. And then there's those that are indifferent or uninvolved, and they spend little time with their children, and they do little more than provide them with food and shelter. Okay. So, those are kind of uninvolved, and those don't lead to good results either. Okay, so parenting style correlates with behaviors of children. All right, well behaved children often come from caring, understanding parents. However, children can affect their parents. Remember, it's a reverse kind of relationship as much as the parents affect the children. So that's important to remember. And then the last two slides talk about non-traditional families and how researchers have found there's no important differences, no significant differences that they've found between children reared by gay or lesbian couples and those reared by heterosexual couples. So when we think of traditional families, we think of the mother, the father, and the children. But when we think of non-traditional, it's other kind of structures, and there's really no research. There hasn't been much research to find any sort of differences. The problem is that most of the studies that have been done have small sample sizes. So the reality is we actually need more research to kind of see if this continues to be on that same path of no real differences. Okay. And then parental conflict and divorce as a final issue to think about in affecting children's behavior and their development over time is, children of divorced parents often show signs of distress, but there's such a variation from individual to individual. So we cannot make general statements that all children of divorce have issues with, let's say their development or their identity development or their social development or anything, because there's just such a variation. It's highly variable. Okay. Research has found that there's been temporary setbacks for some children. Some children remain distressed for years, others recover quickly. There's so many differences in the results that we found. Okay, and there's also variation among different cultures and ethnic groups when it comes to divorce's effects. All right, so again, it's important to look more closely at the research and not make generalizations. Okay, it's also been found that research shows that there's no research that says parents should stay together for the benefit of their children. It actually has been shown that there's some negative effects on children if they observe too much conflict between the parents. So again, behavior affected by this in different ways. There's a variety, so just keep that in mind. Okay, so again, this chapter had a lot about development from prenatal through old age, using some of the major theorists, Piaget, Vygotsky, and Erickson's theories, and then so many other factors that come into play related to gender roles, parental, expectations and parenting styles, and a variety of things that can impact behavior and development. Okay, so lots of great stuff in here. Go back, read the chapter, take a look at the notes again, and ask any questions in class. Okay, all right, see you in class.